Yeah, that was really great, and there's so many points to pick up on. I thought I would just reflect a little bit on what has drawn me to these issues and to discovering more recently, really diving into new animism and reading a number of the sources you had mentioned, and allowing me to understand more about your work, because I've been familiar with things you've been doing for a long time, and I've been more engaged. So it was really great to hear you frame some things that I've been thinking a lot about. And I guess the thing I would want to start with is a story I'd like to tell, and I really appreciated the introduction of art objects as an example of animism, because when we think about these rival ontologies, and when we consider our own longings to varying degrees, depending on the person, for a more enchanted or animated sense of the world, or a recognition of what is lost in a modern secular materialist neuroscientific way of thinking, that, you know, how do we kind of engage with this? How do we experience this? Do I go out, do I feel the spirit of the landscape? Do I feel the spirit of animals? Do I want to participate in some kind of ceremony in order to create these altered states or adjusted styles of communication? But one of the places that when I reflect on my own life, where I've not had to try, where it wasn't a matter of wishing or find, but really of stumbling into, has been encounters with art, with objects. And so that's the kind of place that I'd like to start. And one story, and I've had dozens of these experiences, and it's almost like they sit in a different category in my mind. There's occasional images, that one self-portrait by Van Gogh, this one Orthodox icon painting, one particular New Guinea mask in the museum near where I live, where something happens and there's a different relationship that emerges to this object. And I think one of the more striking ones that happened to me was I was in a museum in Wellington, going through the Maori exhibit, which was extraordinary because they had done a lot of work to do this very properly, and different tribal groups were representing themselves, and there was clearly a great deal of attention paid to doing this in a respectful way that allowed all the different, agents to represent themselves. And there was a remarkable maori, or a meeting house, which is already a site of encounter. It's a place where people would come into the community who are from the outside, and so because they're outsiders, they have some taboo, they have some difficulty, and so they would enter into the space, almost literally entering into almost an ancestral, a living building, in order to become more amenable to real encounter. So I walk into this place, and there's a carved central pillar, this face looking, and I was like fascinated and drawn by this figure. And I don't know very much about Maori civilization. I'm just sort of like, I'm open, but I'm not that knowledgeable. And I'm drawn to this figure, and I step up to it, and I'm staring at it, and I'm not very far away, about this far away from it. And the lighting was really weird, because I would expect the lighting to be like angled so that it would reflect onto the object's face, so it would carve out the shadows nicely, and I could see the detail and the contour. But instead, the light was like facing me. It was like kind of in my eyes, and I couldn't really see very well, but I was looking at this character and trying to see what I was looking at. And in that moment, I had this weird just flash, which is like, oh, I get it. This is set up so that he can look at me. And it was just a kind of flash, like this sort of weird way you think like a kid sometimes. But I stayed with that, and it was a remarkable way of, I think, framing the kind of inversion that can happen when we encounter objects. So I use this word encounter a couple of times. And the one figure I want to bring up now and then start having a discussion is a figure not brought up too often in philosophy these days, which is unfortunate, but was a big hit in the hippie days, which is Martin Buber. And Martin Buber really established a pretty, I think, a way of thinking about relationality that's very helpful in bridging some of these ontologies with more Western styles of thinking. You know, today there's still a great deal of concern with the idea of the other, and in philosophical circles this is often, you know, thought about, at least in continental circles, through the work of Levinas, who's so concerned with the call of the other, the ethical relationship with the other. And so there's a lot of thinking about how do we relate to otherness, how do we relate to these other persons who are not ourselves, not necessarily homogenous with our own cultural background. But in a way, I think Martin Buber has a much richer way of engaging this world, because with Levinas, the other is always an owner of language. It's always essentially human. And that anthropocentrism refuses this relationality to non-human subjects. But with Buber, it's different. And Buber talks about this I-you relationship, or I-thou as it's often translated. And he makes the stark distinction between the I-thou relationship and the I-it relationship. Most of our time we're spending there, we're dealing with its, we're manipulating things, things are in our way, we're sort of negotiating, we're kind of treating people as it's, the bus driver, the guy who's hassling us. We're not necessarily really engaging them as people. But there's this other mode where you're confronted, called, unable to avoid the encounter with another. And we do it all the time. It's totally ordinary. We're standing in the street, someone starts to talk to us, and we really engage them, and we recognize them in their singularity. And something happens that's different than our relationship to objects. And so for Buber, he really wanted to press on this. He really wanted to say, look, this comes first. It's not, you know, it's not our neurons, it's not our cultural programming, it's not our bodies, it's not our genetically determined quest to reproduce. It's this encounter. And an encounter for him that wasn't limited just to human subjects, but also to animals and to trees and other you know, expressions of nature and works of art. That this moment of encounter was always possible. And he made a big distinction between experience and encounter, which is another way of spinning on one of the most interesting things I think you talked about, was the way in which we like to think about shamans in particular, but you know, other ways of viewing the world through the lens of psychology, of altered states, of experiences, hallucinogenic experiences. But there's a significant difference between that and the encounter. When there's an other that calls one out of oneself, and you cannot deny, you can't go back. Even if later on you go, oh well, I was just hallucinating, or I was just whatever, I had some emotional movement, that's why I recognized this object as being something more to me. That's something in the rearview mirror. You know, there's still that call, and in that call is, of course, an ethical call. And I think that call is really important, particularly today, where, you know, for all sorts of reasons, we're recognizing the way in which we're deeply entangled with the world. We're deeply entangled with other objects, with flows of money, with flows of water, with you know, pollution, with all of our you know, our every minute action. If we half paying attention, we see is linked to these massive systemic problems. And there's a real sense of being sort of bound within all of these objects with their own claims. And I think there's a strong desire to figure out a way to relate to the world in a different way, to pull out of this it's all in our skull kind of sense. But it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that considering the encounter both with other humans and then persons who are not necessarily human is one of the ways of doing that. And that art in particular allows a kind of safe space to do that. Because it's a human artifact. There's something, that there's a communication in it. And yet, I think that I suspect anyone who's interested in art, anyone who's been down this road, can have these experiences in their mind where something else happens, something more kind of significant. So I think that would be, you know, I think, well, I'll stop my initial, you know, ramble and maybe press on this a little bit more and talk about the nature of encounter, and particularly about art. I mean, you were looking at both modern art objects that have something more, particularly painting. There's someone like Spare, where there's a kind of spooky sense of enchantment, of some deeper world that's both being revealed and concealed, that draws us in, the kind of enigma that speaks to us, almost literally. And then also those beautiful, extraordinary objects, the axes, where it's like, well, it's not really art in any way that we're going to, be comfortable saying, and yet there are these objects of craft that are clearly made beyond a purely utilitarian level. And there's something about the non-utilitarian object that opens up the possibility of encounter. And since you do so much stuff with art, I'm curious to hear more about how you reflect on experience of objects and artistic objects in particular in relationship to our own attempt to probe these ontologies, these other ways of seeing the world.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about art is that, as you say, it's safe territory because it's open to interpretation on the one hand, and on the other, it's something that doesn't necessarily require language. So we engage with the object in a way which isn't so much to do with language unless we're trying to communicate that to someone else, and the object has an impact on us, and we experience it in a visceral way, and it's less straightforward to analyze it than to experience it. And your own example of the maori with the head in the maori and it looking at you, changing the dynamic. And I think there have been some interesting changes in curatorial practice, not only artistic practice, dealing with that and attempting to offer other ways of engaging with the object. There was a show in Antwerp, I think in about 2007, and then another in Berlin last year, curated by Anselm Frank, entitled Animism, which was attempting to do that, but mainly through modern works rather than ethnographic works, about how in various ways artists and curators have dealt with what we might term animism, or the varieties of animism. And while that's the case, it is still that language is a big part of the problem, in that we have to talk about animism in relation to inanimism. So all of our language for framing this material is done with dualisms which don't necessarily hold and are constructed. So for Tyler, primitive, indigenous people were mistaken because it was quite clear to him that rationally, logically, scientifically, inanimate objects are inanimate, they don't contain life, and it's just stupid to think that a rock does.
Yeah, well, I want to pick up on that too, because that was another question that I have, which is, however much I'm open to these ideas, and however many extraordinary experiences or occasional experiences that I've had or been blessed with, that have pulled me out of that frame, it's still extremely hard for me to get outside of the idea of projection. That the notion that we project values onto the world, and particularly onto quote-unquote inanimate objects, is really, I mean, it's something we take in at a very, it's like that's what we get when we move out of a very early stage of childhood, when we're still involved in that. And so the only way we can really think about it, and I mean sort of speaking generally for Western society, is about the way that kids see the world. Oh, they see a world that's enchanted. They see a world where their teddy bear's alive and the flowers are engaging with them in some kind of way. And so it's, what are ways that we can get around in a sophisticated way, not just an experiential way, in how to get into that alternate ontology, how to release this incredibly dominant story of projection that it's in our psyches. We're just seeing, and it's so basic. I mean, there was like a tit for tat in The Guardian recently about nature. I don't remember, some of you guys might have probably read it. Poole wrote this one thing that was very sardonic attack on people's nostalgia or love for nature, and the way in which it just plays into bourgeois values and it plays into racist values. And it was a very sort of predictable, very, like, in a way almost a paint by numbers kind of critique. at the core of which was this unspoken assumption that, of course, all we're doing is projecting. And in that context, it's like totally, oh, you're right, oh yeah, that's all we're doing. Oh wait, no, that's not, no, that's not quite right. So just in your own thinking, or in some of the material you've read, or even just talking more about De Castro or this notion of perspectivism, how we can sort of almost, using our language, using our concepts, slip into a mode where it's not just projection. Or maybe it has to happen in another way than language and concept directly.
Well, it's difficult. As you say, we've got this inherited tradition, and we're taught from childhood that that kind of perspective is incorrect, that it's fantasy, that it's a projection, that it's made up. I think I've pointed to some ways in which, nonetheless, as Western adults, educated in the systems we're educated in, we do still engage with the world in ways which aren't entirely about objectivity and analysis. But I think it's an important part of the thinking that's going on this subject is from post-humanists. So looking beyond the humanist position, which clearly led in some respects to various forms of racism when we're dealing with Victorian anthropologists who are setting out who were the better races and better humans, to seeing a world which we can dominate, that we can exploit as simply resources. And from a perspectival point of view, if we see the world as filled with persons only some of whom are human, then we need to take seriously those other perspectives rather than take ourselves as the starting point, the central point, but actually part of a much wider framework in which relationships with others are important. And I think that's what some of this Amazonian anthropology can speak to us as modern Westerners and how we engage with the world. It's difficult because it's such a radically different way of approaching the world, and the language we have to translate it is inadequate. So talking about other than human persons is all very cumbersome and can start to look like a projection when it might not be. I've lost my thread.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You brought up a lot of stimulating ideas there. One of to pick up on the post-human thing, it's actually kind of interesting that I think as we more and more ways in our society, from philosophy to actual sort of ordinary daily practice, we are sort of leaving, or on the edge of leaving, this humanist period. That whether we're thinking in terms of how can we conceive of the human being, when we're trying to locate where value comes from, when we look at the way in which we're actually embedded in terms of technological devices, when we look at where decisions are made in society, we're more and more grappling with this sort of no longer human in the driver's seat perspective. And it's actually at this moment, which in some ways is a deeply technological, deeply skeptical, deeply confused, and unmoored moment, that some of this archaic consciousness, to think about it, and maybe that's a problematic phrase, becomes, if not more available, then at least more thinkable in a certain way. And one person that I like to think of these issues with is Bruno Latour, who has, I would say, kind of running in parallel with some of this new animist thought. And one of the main concerns that Latour has is to think about how things happen in terms of the networks of all of the objects and processes that compose them. So he's kind of an anthropologist of the modern West. He looks at science. How does a scientific fact get produced? The generic story is that the heroic scientist does the research, discovers some principle, it's backed up with experimental evidence. We figured out something new, great. And Latour goes, okay, that's fine. But what really happened is that you have this human being who receives certain kind of training, their perceptions trained in a certain way through various institutional modes. They're engaging with a physical object which has its own history, this microscope. The material and data is recorded in a certain fashion with certain kinds of machines which do certain processes that work on the data. The data is then moved through these various institutional locations in order to produce something like a fact, like a new fact about the world. And he wants to look at that whole process as what's really happening, sometimes called the actor network theory. And one way of saying it is that in that process, everything has a little bit of agency. It's no longer the human as the agent manipulating a dead world, setting processes in motion, exploiting, taking. Instead, it's this collective, collaborative process where things have agency. And in this structure, it kind of makes sense. You can think about, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I can see why there's kind of an agency in the computer. There's a kind of an agency in the institutional formation that organizes scientific, the production of scientific facts. And you're like, okay, what is agency? What does it mean to relate to agency? How does an agent appear? And then you start getting into the space of like, well, what do? You encounter an agent. You don't just manipulate it. And so there's a certain kind of slippage for me in that way of approaching things that allows for a greater space for recognizing the contributions that things have, that the room, the space of the room has, the microphone, all of these things are contributing to this moment. And even if that's not animism in the sense that we're talking about in terms of other than human persons, it's decomposing some of that human-centered way of approaching, and I think opens up a space for larger kinds of encounters, whatever those things might be. So, how in your own practice of navigating these like different perspectives, these different ontologies, you know, in your own, both your personal and your professional and your intellectual, you know, pursuits, how does your idea of what an object is change? How does your sense of what an object is slip in a way?
Good question. Well, I suppose that on the one hand, on a daily basis, well, I don't want to go around calling myself an animist. I don't want to associate myself with indigenous ways of thinking as another form of colonialism, because I'm not an indigenous person and I don't understand the world in the way Amazonian peoples do. But I think that there's useful thinking emerging from this sort of discussion. And I suppose on a daily basis, when I turn my television on, I'm not really engaging with that as an other than human person. I don't talk to it. I suppose it talks to me. But there are other things, and taking that indigenous nod that not everything is animate all of the time, there are other things which do seem more animate than others, and I suppose taking a walk in the woods, which can be a rejuvenating act, a rejuvenating experience, does involve an encounter with the natural world, which has an effect, to use your word, that encounter, that experience. By the end of it, I feel different. It's had an effect on me. Other objects, I suppose, more sort of, for want of a better word, religious objects and the sort of power they have. I don't think it's any coincidence that shamans do have often a great deal of paraphernalia in order to adjust their style of communication, because it requires this sort of assistance to really disrupt yourself in order to get into a different perspective. And I suppose some art objects do that, perhaps not as powerfully as a Darhad shaman's costume. And I haven't donned a Darhad shaman's costume, but I imagine that it's a pretty affecting experience which could really change your perspective on the world.
Yeah, let's pick up on the costume. That was one element that in my recent reading that I found most extraordinary, and De Castro was, again, the Viveros De Castro was the most articulate about it, was this idea that in some sense these other than human persons are kind of like us. They're just not human. But they have a sort of person world that we would recognize. You know, even to the extent he talks about For some in Amazonian tribes, it's like when the jaguar is, consuming the flesh of a beast and drinking its blood. For the jaguar, that blood is manioc beer. The feathers on the bird of prey are a costume, a dress, so that there is a similar set of person-like attributes, but then get distributed differently. And what makes these different worlds different is not their minds, their spirits, which are actually have a shared character, personhood. What makes them different and build different worlds is their bodies. That it's the body that is a probe that produces different perspectives and different worldviews, and therefore that opens up that idea which you articulated very well, that it's precisely in changing the body through costume, through mask, through ritual gestures, through relationships with objects, through relationships with places, that different modes of communication can be uncovered. It's really an extraordinary idea, especially when we think about how leaden our own ideas of our bodies are. But we just have one thing, it's just getting older, it looks pretty much the same. Yeah, you can tart it up a bit with some makeup, occasionally wear a costume for Halloween, but there's not a lot of modification, with some important exceptions. Obviously some people take tattoos very seriously. There's a whole world of modification that, again, not coincidentally, draws from some ethnographic inspiration. I think that's not an accident. Again, part of this sort of cultural desire, often inchoate, often very problematic, for a kind of return to another view. And so I wonder about that. I wonder about our sense of our bodies shifting and the capacity for transformation through embodiment as another site of being able to understand, what this kind of animist, view would be like. All right, 5 minutes, and so I would like to hear you think a little bit more, or talk a little bit more about the body and how that manifests.
Yeah. Well, from an Amazonian point of view, it's interesting because it totally disrupts our understanding of the world, in the sense that we have culture as humans, and that nature is something which is out there that we project upon. So we are humans, we're the dominant species, and we dominate nature that we live in because it's something out there that we can dominate. But from an Amazonian point of view, it's not that nature is out there and we have culture, it's that culture is everywhere, and what is different about everything is the way that it's natured, the way that it's bodied, the way that it has a body. So as you mentioned the example there, the jaguar drinking blood, which from its perspective is beer. I mean, that's a tough one as well, because then do we see that as anthropomorphism? Isn't that just a really good example of those indigenous people just projecting onto their world? But I don't think it is. I think that's another way of translating, and the problems of language, of trying to translate those perspectives. Which is why I think when shamans have their experiences, they come back with what were interpreted in the early ethnographic documents as wildly fantastical experiences, because it is really difficult to convey and relate this sort of material to those that haven't been in that other perspective. So yeah, in terms of the body, I mean, there are interesting things happening in terms of cyborgs and people changing themselves through. I was at a conference last month, and there was someone doing a paper about people implanting things into themselves, such as magnets into their fingertips. I mean, I don't know how useful that really is, but as a way of modifying the body in addition to tattooing and so on, it is interesting that these sorts of things are going on, and how we aren't keeping up with the technology in terms of our great human way of understanding the world. Actually, the technology in some ways is ahead of us, and it's us trying to keep up with it, which isn't to say that we're going to soon have computers or similar sorts of things which can think like humans. I think actually what they're going to do is something on their own terms, probably quite different from what we're intending them to do. But bodies are quite interesting in this experience.
Well, like the technology stuff sets up the second half of the program, and but I want to just open up for one or two questions if anybody has it. We'll do questions at the end as well. Yeah, in the back.
Hi there. Yes, a couple of few things. I'm interested to see, how this journey of primitivism to animism, Victorian animism to new animism, where uses anthropologists or philosophers or thinkers or researchers in new animism, where, in my experience as a practicing artist, it's about engaging with the other. I mean, Socrates, the classical civilized session then, said that if a stone would speak, I would listen. And that was 1,000 years ago. Have we learned anything, from this discussion? It's good to talk about these things, but using a new word like neonimism to address this age-old understanding of reality. Optimism is a dead word, and using neonimism, and where's the gaps in that?
So you said animism is a dead word?
No, you're saying that otherness is a kind of a dead word, or the connecting with that. I mean, I like the words you're using with encounter and edge and these things. To me, and words like engaging in this is like it's useful words, but it's quite this discussion of neonimism seems to be quite playful. We're still trying to find new words and useful words for what is.
Did you say playful?
Yes, quite playful. Yeah.
Well, I like that. I think that's quite good. I think that it is a lot about playing with words. There's a very good edited volume called Thinking Through Things, which I think came out in 2007, where there are a group of anthropologists who are doing ethnography, and rather than just assuming that the material could be interpreted, anthropologists don't do that anymore, but starting with the material itself to think through the thing in order to understand it rather than project onto it, which I think is an interesting idea. It's a very good set of papers in there, particularly the introduction. But it's interesting you mentioned Socrates, and if the stone could speak, then he would listen. And I think it's a perennial problem in terms of our engagement with the other. But what's interesting from a new animistic point of view would be that being able to listen in the right way. So it's up to us as humans, if we want to talk to stones, if some stones are animate, if we want to talk to them, then it's up to us to adjust ourselves to listen to them, because they aren't going to speak English or humanish. How we do that is another matter.
We'll end with this one. Go ahead.
Yeah. But the stone must have to want to talk to you, and you have to ask how the stone feels. It's not just stones. And I think I find this whole conversation quite problematic. Because it is coming from the Western, whatever you want to call it, part of the brain, and if it was just a shamanic journey, there would be no discussion. It would just be the experience of what we're talking about. And projection, whether things are anthropomorphized or not, in association with spirits or spirits of things or energetic things, that are different people from human people. It's never just projection. If you look for the results, and the whole point of shamanism is to integrate with reality, to bring what that is back into reality, and then it becomes proved, and often by the unexpected, by things that you couldn't possibly have known, and how it is communicated back to you from the environment, no matter through which type of human or non-human person. So it's always hard for me to sit and listen to this, and also the assumption that there are indigenous people's beliefs and Western people's beliefs, because not all Western people think like, from a philosophical standpoint, based on Socrates, we still have the mindset of Socrates that can't hear a rock, apparently, but not everybody does. And really, you just, like with the cave paintings, you would just have to adjust your consciousness to communicate with the cave paintings to know what they were, instead of projecting what they were. So I guess I just have a problem with how things about shamanism are discussed from an academic perspective, because it is encountering, it is experiential, as you have said, and there's no other way to know it other than doing that.
Yeah. No, I totally hear what you're saying. I mean, the way I would frame it is that, you know, like you say, society is unevenly distributed in terms of people's orientations and their kinds of experiences. And both of us up here have had a wide range of experiences. For various reasons, we find ourselves in the world of discourse. And one way to think about it a little bit more, maybe holistically isn't quite the right word, but systemically, is that there are parts of the West that are changing rapidly. There are individuals who are diving as far into these experiences as they can with as much heart and grace and paying attention and not falling into the numerous traps that lie for people who try to adopt indigenous perspectives. There are many copious problems with this that I'll just leave aside, and just to say yes, and those experiences are real, they're real for you, they make changes, but those are also happening in a larger society that is extremely turbulent right now. And one of the ways that the effects of those experiences radiate out into a much more benighted, confused place in terms of dealing with these mysteries is through discourse. So that we're sort of like on the edge between these zones where you're like, look, you just have to go in there and have these experiences. Great, but not everyone's going to do that. So what happens on the edge is you get these boundary conditions where discourse becomes playful, a little confusing, who knows exactly what's happening, but through the gaps and the concepts that emerge, people are able to begin to see the world in a different way. So if you can allow someone to let go of the ontology, just conceptually, not in terms of, because you haven't had them, you can't convince them to go into a shamanic circle or to change their whole way of being, but if you can convince them that like there's a problem, a fundamental problem with the idea that we are projecting things on to dead objects, that there's a crack in that basic orientation, that's already good work. So it's like you do different work at different scales. That's the way I would say it.
Just to add to that, you're quite right that also it's not about learning to communicate with the rock, it's whether or not the rock is prepared to communicate with you, and that's the next level there, going through the crack and having the experience, whether or not you meet the communicative level does require, if you're establishing a relationship, which is what new animism is about, that other than human person wanting to have the relationship with you.
So, one more here. Yeah.
Thank you both. Great stuff. I think that perhaps we shouldn't talk about discussing things with rocks, but talking with these things here. Because we're all talking with these objects. And I was so surprised that none of you actually, I'm talking about smartphones, none of you actually brought this up. And I'm just really curious to hear what do you think about us interacting with a particular typology of object that actually are designed to talk back to us in a way that makes us think that this world out there is magic, is enchanted, it's talking back to us, it's alive, because we call it technology, we actually call it smart, which means perhaps better than us. So where is the human, where is the non-human, who is the animate, who is the non-animate in relation to technology? I really want to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be covering some of this stuff in the second half, but yeah. So there's a lot of implicit animism in our relationship to digital technologies. I just saw an ad for the latest Samsung Galaxy, and the tag was "a life companion." And the word companion is really interesting because you're like, that's basically a person, you know. Like, but we could call a dog a companion. Well, but a dog is already kind of a. So it's a really clever phrase because it gets right on that ambiguous edge of personhood with these devices. So, but there's much more to be said, and it's a hot room, and I think we should probably take a 15-minute break and.